Well, g'day everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. I'm John James and I'm passionate about enabling change and innovation, and that's why I'm hosting today's webinar, where we can explore and discuss issues relating to enabling change and innovation. Now, the technology we're using today is really easy for you to use. So here's an image of the GoToWebinar floating control panel, as they call it. Now, it's fully expanded at the moment when you first see it, but the clever little thing hides itself after a couple of minutes so that you can better concentrate on the presentation, of course. But if at any time that you'd like to expand it again, you just have to click on the little orange arrow here and it'll come back to the full size there for you. Now, to listen to today's webinar, you can either use a telephone or a computer headset. Now, if you're using a telephone, make sure that you've clicked the right button on your screen here, so just on the audio part of the floating control panel. You then get your details on the screen, so don't follow the ones that are on my screen because you get your own very personalized ones. Now, you can interact with us today by raising your electronic hand or by typing in the questions box down the bottom. Only the organisers get to see your hand or what you type. And if you ask a question, I'll read it out so it's anonymous. So hey, let's practice. If you can hear me clearly, can you please now raise your electronic hand? Phew, thank goodness for that. It's great to have a live audience out there. Now, if you click on your little hand sign again, it'll lower your hand for you. So if you can do that, that'd be great. Okay. Now, there's been quite a lot of interest in today's webinar with over 250 people registering. I can see that we've had folk from most parts of Australia and several overseas locations as well. And see, when you registered for the event, I asked you to type in the town that you're nearest to, and with that information, I've now created this little Wordle, or from the folk at Tuxedo in actual fact. So it's a word jumble showing where people are from. Now, today I've used a squirrel because Jeff has just spent a couple of months in Canada and asked me to use a suitable Canadian animal, and I couldn't find a moose. So here we go, folks, it's a squirrel because I love squirrels. Now, anyway, you can see that we've got a large number of people from Brisbane here today who no doubt are looking forward to their public holiday tomorrow, where they'll be visiting the Ekka. That's their contraction for the Royal Exhibition, the Ekka. And other popular locations with us today are Perth and Melbourne, Rockhampton, and even Edmonton in Canada. So it's great that all those people have registered. So it's good that you're able to be with us here live today. So I'm now just going to launch a poll to see where folk are from who are actually joining us live. So here's a map of Australia, so I think you've caught on, but for the overseas folk, South Australia is down the bottom here, and we're going in an anti-clockwise direction round to New South Wales, and then the top half, so Queensland, Northern Territory and WA, which of course is both top and bottom half. I got caught last time, some people commented that I made the mistake of saying that Western Australia was Northern Australia. So folks, I'll just close it off in a couple of seconds. 3, 2, 1, close, and I'll now share the results with you. So you can see, indeed, once again, so the people from Queensland, Northern Territory and WA are the winners, and then there's a whole bunch of people from the rest of Australia as well, which is great. And we do have someone from New Zealand and a few people from Canada, so that's just lovely. So thanks for everyone. I'll now hide that again. Okay, so folks, for best results today, may I suggest that you turn off your email and any other little programs you've got running in the background and tune in to what our speaker will be talking about today. I encourage you to take notes as you go along, because that will just help you focus and concentrate. And finally, prepare questions. So as our presenter is talking about things, just jot them down, questions you'd like to ask. And of course, use the little Q&A panel at the bottom of your control panel to type those in. So, folks, today the topic is designing effective surveys in 3 easy steps. We all know how useful good quality survey results can be, whether we're evaluating a multi-million-dollar 3-year project or just a one-day event. And if we fail to ask the right questions, we aren't going to get the quality responses that we're looking for. Now, don't forget that the results from surveys not only help us with how we have performed in the past, but they can be very, very useful for asking questions of your target audience about future events as well. Now, folks, to help us to understand the background of the audience today, I'm just going to share another poll with you, and that's to ask you how many surveys you have already created today, this year. So there's the poll that's open now, so if it's just 1 or 2 or maybe 6 to 9, you can now indicate on this poll, because that'll give us a good indication as to the experience of the folk that we're dealing with today. Great, I'll just give you a couple of seconds there. I see most people have now voted. So I'll close that off with a 90% response rate, which is great, and I'll share that on screen. So I can see that about 1/3 of the people haven't had an opportunity to create a survey yet, and almost half have done 1 or 2, and then there's a small group of people who have had greater experience. So that's great. So thanks for doing that. I'll now hide that again. Today we've got the pleasure of having Jeff Coutts with us today. Jeff is the Director of Coutts J&R, and at this stage I will just pass the baton over to Jeff, so that's appropriate now that the Olympic Games have just finished. So I'll make Jeff the presenter so he can now put his slides up there for us as I introduce him. So Jeff is well known to many of us, particularly through his connection with APEN. Jeff has a strong background in managing and evaluating change in rural industries and communities. He has reviewed and many rural, agricultural and regional projects and programs. He also runs evaluation training at postgraduate level and through short courses. Jeff is increasingly being sought as an evaluation mentor for projects and program teams. So Jeff, welcome along. It's lovely to have you with us today. Over to you.
Right, thanks John. And can we just quickly check that everyone can hear me? Can you just raise your hand if I'm coming in strong and you can see my first slide? All right, well, let's continue. For those of you around the place, I assume that I've come across many of you in my travels, and for those I haven't, it's good to meet you, albeit from a distance and very one way at the moment. But anyway, thanks for sharing this time and going through this really fascinating subject with me. It's going to be a little bit of a rush, but I'll try and keep it so that it's nice and clear, and we'll see how we go. There are a couple of places through the presentation where we stop, so you've got a chance to ask a couple of questions and take a breath, and me too, and we'll see how we go through. You'll notice that I've got a slightly different topic here because I've selected a particular type of survey. I've selected an impact evaluation survey, given that there are many other different kinds of surveys. There are market research surveys of various persuasions. There's a range of different surveys you can do, and I thought the best thing we could do today was focus on a particular type and look at the logic of that. Because impact evaluation is such a big issue with many of us, that's the one that I've selected. So the 3 steps that were in the title, the original title, is really about looking at the survey context, because that really shapes what you're asking and how you ask it. Having a survey framework so that you can be very systematic in the way you look at it, and then of course going into the survey design. Now, I've talked about the fact that I'm focusing on a particular type of evaluation and that other surveys will be a little bit different to this. And I'm also not saying that this is the textbook answer for designing surveys, but it's what I found in the last dozen or so years over time that seems to work pretty well for impact evaluations and what most of the clients seem to be wanting or getting value from. And I'm sure there are other ways of doing things, and if we all sat around a table, we could improve on this, and I'm relying on that as part of the discussion. What I mean by survey context is to be really clear about the purpose of the survey. Who's it for? How are they going to use the results? Is it just you know, something that has to be done, or do they really want to know something that you need to focus on? And in that sort of context, that's why I picked on an impact evaluation, you know, what's happened post or as a result of a series of activities or projects. The survey frame means who you're actually surveying. You know, it's one thing, for example, to say I'm surveying sheep producers in New South Wales. And for you overseas people, you already know where New South Wales is now, thanks to John. But what sort of frame can you actually survey? Do you have the contact details of every single sheep producer in New South Wales? Well, you probably don't. So you probably some kind of a subset of that, and by the contact details you've got. And that's important to take into account when we sort of start looking at the representativeness of the results and how they're used. Let's move on to this representativeness and how administered, because that's also part of the survey context. I'm asked a lot by people, look, how many do we need to survey to make it statistical? And in fact, I used to drive my biometrician, Kerry Bell, mad by asking her the same question for many years. The simple answer is, if you want to make a statement about a population, hence you want a randomised survey or representative, then it's not the issue so much of how many people do I have to survey. It's really how accurate do you want it to be. So if you look at this table that Terry has done on the screen, you can see that if you interview just 2 people, if you survey 2 people out of a large population, then the chances that the population mean is in the results is plus or minus 49. It's you know, a huge variation. As you go up, you get to 100, and you find that if once you survey randomly and across the population, then you're looking at a figure of more like plus or minus 10% of confidence that the mean for the whole population lies between your results. But as you start going beyond 100, you start seeing quite a diminishing value for interviewing more people. And so the issue is, how much money do you have, and how important is it to have a certain level of accuracy? So hence I'm saying how accurate you want it to be is the better question. But this presentation isn't all about sampling, so I'm not going to push that point. If you're doing a non-randomised survey, then just be clear about your basis for your statement. So you're saying, look, X respondents who were selected on this basis, and that might have been because they were easy to contact, they rated the value of the project at such and such. So it's really, it's not saying that they have to be a representative. It's saying that if they're not, just state what the actual survey results relate to. And very quickly on how administered. Web and mail surveys are relatively cheap to administer, but again, you get relatively low return rates. You know, web surveys and mail surveys somewhere between 5 and 30%, you know, depending on who you're surveying and how much work you've done towards it. The big issue there is the non-respondents and how much, you know, the people who have responded are biased the results. The phone and face-to-face, you can get a lot closer figure to the people who you're targeting for responses and who give you the results. So not only can you get a sort of a more random view, but you'll also get a lot lower non-respondent rate. So that's the kind of play-off between those methods. For most of my surveys with producers, farmers for example, I use a phone because you get them in place, talk. For a lot of people in government, they're not bad with web surveys if they feel that it's something worthwhile. The important thing setting all this up with context is making sure that people who you're likely to interview or to contact, they know what's going on and why, and it also gives them an opportunity to opt out, and this really increases your response rate and the way in which people participate and join in. So very strong on letting people know in advance what's happening or what might happen. It means that when you ring, for example, it's not a cold call. It makes a big difference. Okay, so that is a very quick little thumbnail in terms of context, but critical to the way, the questions you ask and the way you ask them. The survey framework that we've developed over the years in terms of looking at impact type evaluation follows this. And it's kind of like my checklist to make sure that I've either got questions in each area or I've decided that this one isn't needed for this kind of survey. And we'll go through systematically some of these different levels not in too much detail, but just enough to get a flavour and a feel for why I've got those in my framework and the kind of questions that I'd ask and how I think about asking them. So I'm not going to read through them individually there, but we'll deal with them one by one. And there'll be other ideas on this, I'm sure. Well, the other thing that I'd like to stress here is that if I'm doing an impact evaluation survey, on next to me I've got the log frame of the project or the program, or I've got the key results that they're aiming for, or I've got the objectives of the project and what they were trying to achieve. Because I'm always trying to make sure that I'm designing a survey that absolutely makes sense with what the project was about and what it was likely to and wanted to achieve. And that to me is quite critical on this. There's a real danger in designing surveys that you ask everything that moves, you drive everyone crazy. But if you can be quite focused on there, you can do something that's of value to everyone. Quick little introduction, setting up the context. So before we go into the actual questions, I wondered, John, if this isn't the time to just pause and let anyone react or ask something.
And that's a great idea, Jeff. So I'm just looking, and there are no questions at the moment. So, folks, this would be a great time if you wanted to now type some things in. Actually, here's the first one now, Jeff. Just takes people a moment or two to get their fingers to the keyboard. You talked about a log frame, and you had a picture of a house being constructed. Can you explain what a log frame is, please, Jeff?
Logs, yeah. Log frame is short for logical framework. And it's laying out, you know, preferably in a table form, or it could be in a diagram form, what the project's trying to achieve and how it plans to get there. And so it's oh, okay, that's what you're trying to achieve. Oh, and that's what you're doing to get there. So when you're then designing some evaluation or an impact evaluation question, you know what activities to ask about. You know what they were trying to do, and you also know what they were heading towards, so you can ask questions about whether they've achieved there. So log frame, logical framework, just really maps out the project so that you can twin an evaluation plan to it.
Okay, that's good. And here's another one. Do letter-based surveys return better than face-to-face? So I guess the response rate.
No, I mean, the thing with face-to-face is that you actually target people and you line them up and you talk to them and you then go and visit them. And most people, you know, if they've got the time, they'll make the time for you and you can come and do it. So you get a very good return rate in that rate because you're dealing with, you know, the targeted individuals. When you send out a mail survey, particularly a cold one, or a web survey and people are getting heaps in their email things, then it's really, they've got to be prompted or have some kind of interest or just be a nerd, in a sense, to respond. So you get a lot lower response rates with mail and web these days than you do to face-to-face and telephone.
That's good. And Jeff, if you want to just maybe go back to that slide of Carey's with the different confidence levels. So the question is, if you're doing a survey with workshop participants of about 30 people, how many survey responses do you need to have confidence in your results?
Well, the thing when you're working with a very small population like that is you're not really dealing with statistics anymore. You're dealing with actual numbers. So if you've only got 30 and you get, you know, back 25 to 30 responses, you've basically got a pretty full suite of responses, and you don't have to worry about plus or minus, because whatever the average response is of that group of people is the average of that population. It's not like you really have to estimate. But if you're, you know, say you've got a group of 100 and you want to survey a number of those, then you're probably looking at, you know, get your plus or minus 10% accuracy. You don't need to check it exactly. You probably still want about 50 or 60 out of that 100 to get that that level of accuracy. So there's all this issue of diminishing returns. The smaller population, you actually need more people. But once you get past 500,000 people, then it's just a large population.
Okay. Jeff, I'm conscious of time, so I'll just ask one more question, and that's relating to the material you've covered. So are you assuming that interviews are a form of survey?
Yeah, look, there are different kind of interviews, of course. But I guess what I'm saying is that an interview technique and face-to-face can be used to administer a more formal survey. So you can interview people, you know, with very open questions. You can do it with semi-structured questions, or you can do it with quite structured questions. So it is just another way of getting information from people, and you can certainly administer a survey through interviews.
Great. Okay. And I can see I've now got a bunch of questions, but some of them are relating to material that I think you're going to cover shortly. So how about you continue with your presentation?
Right, John. Sounds great. Okay, let's go. So let's go to actually designing the questions. And again, I might start with some of these principles that I'd like to deal with. So directly linked, now I've got project KRAs. What I mean there is key result areas, which again I'm talking about an impact evaluation. So I want to really know what impact that the project was trying to have. So make that link. Don't just, although you also want to pick up things that other kind of impacts that are unintended, that's fine, but make sure you do pick up the ones that were intended. Secondly, you know, be systematic. So what I say is go through all the sections of the framework. Now it might be that some sections aren't relevant to you, so if you just run an activity and they haven't had a chance to do anything, then there might be no point in asking about practice change unless it's related to earlier activities. So that might not be relevant immediately to you. So just the capacity type of impact might be the one that's critical. My theme, minimum questions to get the job done, keeps everybody happy and keeps things nice and smooth. I'm actually, by preference, a real social open question researcher. But the more and more I've got into impact evaluation surveys where you've got quite a clear impact that you're looking for, I'm really keen on preset choices as much as possible while still leaving scope for other things to come in. But you can't just have preset questions or use scales because sometimes you don't understand why certain answers are given. So the qualitative questions are really to understand the reasons behind more quantitative responses. And of course, as you all probably know, and there's a lot of experienced surveys in there, test survey on peers and friendlies. Friendlies being people from the group that you're going to be interviewing. And also, just once you get a couple of test results, try and analyse them so you've got an idea what it might look like at the end, and then you might slightly retwig your survey. Just reinforcing the idea that all these things come from the project information. Now, to go through some of these different areas, I want to use an example. This is a fictitious example. I've made it up. Just for the point of highlighting some of the issues to do with survey designs and types of surveys. So you could read through this, but I've invented this brew project. Social media is the order of the day, and someone's got the idea that we could really improve small business profitability in the small towns around southwest Queensland if only we gave them training on using social media for business, and that's the objective. And so to run this project over the 2 years, these workshops were run, both introductory and advanced. Certain individuals came to the workshop who wanted extra help, were given follow-up, individual follow-up. There was a website on using social media. You think it would have been Facebook. There were advertisements and articles in local newspaper, and there were media ads that were promoting the advantages, etc. So they were the kind of activities that were being used to meet this overall objective. And when I really asked to put it, well, what do you really hope to achieve by 2 years? And this is really what I call a key result area, or it kind of fit like a SMART goal. So by the end of the 2-year period of the project, we're going to have increased the awareness of social media business opportunities across the small business owners in these 3 target communities. We're going to engage 150 directly in workshops with 50 in individual follow-up, and we're going to really increase their capacity, their understanding and skills and motivation. And not only that, but by the time we finish the 2 years, 100 of them are actually going to be using more social media, with 50 planning to do so. That's what we're going to promise you by the end of the 2 years. And why are we doing this? Because we expect that there'll be a 20% business growth in those who make the change, and that there'll be a 10% increase in profitability. So why wouldn't the government fund it? Because they really care about small business. Anyway, the 2 years are up. we've come in, we're developing our survey, impact survey, to have a look at that. And just by the way, for this survey, we've chosen 120 people to survey because that'll roughly cost us around about $12,000, $15,000, and our budget's $20,000, and that's how we couldn't really go much more than that. So we made a choice based on the resources we had, the level of accuracy we needed, and what made sense. Righto. Now you'll notice that at the top of my framework, I've got the word preamble, and I think it's critical both in the pre-information that's sent out, but also reinforced on the survey instrument or through the telephone interviewer. Exactly again what this survey is about, its context, its purpose, the fact of any kind of independence, if it's truly independent, and the fact that individual results will not be linked to people's names. The other thing I think is really good to promise is that they can have access to at least a summary of the survey at the end of it, so that they haven't just given results into ether and never heard from it again. And I think they're some of the key elements that I'd include in the preamble. You also might include how long the survey might take, and that's something else that can be put in. All right, so now let's get to this sort of key issue of demographics, and that's the one where I have most problem with when I'm working with groups, because there's a tendency to want to ask everything that moves. Is your age between 21 and 25, between 26 and 30, etc.? And you think, why do you need that information? Or, you know, do you, I don't know, all sorts of questions are asked. So the question is, what do we really need to ask? Now, look at the demographics question and say, well, what's the project about? So the project's about regional small businesses in southwest Queensland with a focus on these three areas. Okay, so the very least you want to know is where does the respondent come from, and make sure they're in the area and what area they come from. Good. Secondly, we happen to know that the Queensland government sort of funded project. They allocate categories of business under agriculture, forestry and fishing, mining, manufacturing and services and other. So we might as well be consistent and categorise the responses based on that, because it'll make sense to the funders. So I like in my survey, particularly the written ones, to have a little bit of friendliness up the top, like it will help us to know some basic information rather than where are you from. So, and I use please words, please indicate in which community your business is based. So we're picking up on that and also seeing whether there are any outliers there. Who's not in these three towns? Do we exclude them? Do we include them? How come they're there? And again, we're also picking up on what the others are here. The reason I've asked how many employees they have, now a small business here in this definition is from 0 to 19. I want to see if I exclude some because they're not a small business. And also I might want to group some of the results depending upon whether they've got 15 to 20 or whether they've got only 1 or 2 employees. So that's kind of my rationale. Now, we could have asked other demographics, and the only reason we ask other demographics is if it could help us explain the differences in responses. So whether they've attended the workshops or not could really affect some of the way they rate the benefits. The age in this one could be quite important because of the social media thing, and more when I'm dealing with computer stuff and social media and internet, I'm using the age brackets for Gen Y, Gen X, whatever, and then I sort of sort the responses according to the generational figures that everyone uses. Maybe their previous use of social media is quite a good one to explain things, and maybe getting their level of income or profit might help me with my analysis at the end when I look for potential impacts on practice change. So my point here is that you really think through and you argue and use the devil's advocate. Do we need this information? If we do we just want categories or do we need numbers? So it's a pretty critical one, which is often overdone. All right. Now, I try to include one question that's a straw poll question. It's like if you could only ask one question, what would you ask if you lost all the other data? I also use this straw poll question to test those different demographic things that I've captured to see whether they impact on the result. So to me, this is a pretty important one and determines how much more analysis I do later down the trail. So for you, think about it. If you could ask one question about this project, and that was your impact evaluation, what would it be? Just think for a moment. Yeah, okay. Well, this was mine. I use the term useful a lot. I don't use enjoyable or anything like that. I use useful. So how useful have you found the information activities of the program in helping you move forward in the area of using social networking more effectively for your business? Now, here I've got a scale, you know, from 0 to 10, which is pretty common for me. Sometimes I separate out the 0, like no use, and then have a scale from 1 to 10. But nonetheless, this 0 to 10 is useful. I use it because my biometrician, Kerry, tells me that if you want to do statistical comparison between different groups and responses, or responses over time, it gives you more space to move than, say, a 1 to 5 scale. I also use it because the decimalisation and the way we talk about 1 to 10 and we score things, it's just in everyone's mind. You get an incredible consistency. And I use a 0 because some people don't even want to say they're on the scale. I also give people the option to say, look, they haven't got enough knowledge of the program or this to offer an opinion or no answer. Now, here's a case where I've asked them to rate it, but if everyone just rates it as 3, I'm just left, oh, what? So I do want a bit of a comment on that, just so that I can get a feel for why people rated it, say, here in general rather than here. Now, process, even though I've said it's an impact evaluation, often I want to find out the link between the process used and the impacts that it had. But I'm always reluctant to ask too many questions about the details of activities because we've probably got them from feedback from workshop participants. We've probably interviewed the people who had the individual follow-up. We've got other kind of data. So my main interest in this evaluation, with its focus on impact, is what impacted, or what really helped people and what didn't. And so you know, what would you ask in terms of about the process? For me, I just went in with a question like this for the example, and probably if I thought about it more, we could develop it a bit further. But so what, if anything, did you find most helpful in better considering the use of social media in your business? Oh, in your business it should be. So these are the activities that we use. So I want them to pick, notice that I've said, well, most helpful, as opposed to rate them from 1 to 10 or whatever. And I've given them the categories so that I don't have to go through and sort them into categories later. I'm giving a little bit of a chance that they can bring in some of the other things if they want to when they comment. And I'm also asking them, well, what else would have been helpful, so that I can really get a handle on these activities and process. We could have also said, look, list the top 3, or we could have had a little scale for each one where they list it from 1 to 10 if they, or whatever. So there are other ways of doing it, but I don't ask a lot of process questions. I ask them really to the point in an impact evaluation. We're coming to another break soon, so just relax, think of a question. So what, we get to capacity now. What I mean by capacity is, and for me that's often really the most important gain rather than what particular action they took after your survey or after your project. It's what capacities did they gain that in the long term will move them towards the overall objective of what you're trying to do anyway. So capacity is pretty important. It's not just an interim step. And the whole aim was developing people's capacity to increase their use of social media or their effective use. So those of you who know Bennett's hierarchy, you know about CASA, knowledge, attitude, skills, and aspirations. And I often find that they're a very good basis for thinking about capacity questions. So if you see in this slide, and I could have asked another one about awareness, but to what extent, I'm always linking it back to the program. I don't want just in general, I want to be able to put the answers back to the program. To what extent has the use of social media, has the program activities increase your understanding, increase your confidence, increase your belief or intention, and please make comments overall about those ratings. And of course I would have put that under each one of those. So that's how I would go about approaching this capacity question. Now I'm aware of time, so I've got to keep moving. So again, John, just might be a quick time to break before we go into practice, change and impacts about questions today.
Yep, okay. So there's a group of questions that are doing about increasing response rates. I'll just read a few of these out and you might then make some general comments. So, Jeff, what role do financial and other incentives play in enhancing the response rate for the various forms of survey? And another one is, how can you increase response rate for web surveys? And what about the use of bribes like competitions, etc., to improve response rate?
Okay, just quickly on that, I'm not averse to the use of those kind of incentives. What I have said though is that by alerting people in advance about the survey and their interest in it, then hopefully that you go into their altruistic and interest area and they respond, and that will increase it rather than sort of a cold survey. Secondly, I know when we were surveying people who attended a great big sort of field day type thing in Queensland that was being run quite regularly, if you offered an incentive, like they went into the draw for a 3-day holiday at the coast, we got something like 80% response rate. When we just offered them a bit of feed supplement, we got about a 20% response rate. So I did know that the kind of incentive can make a bit of a difference. I'm just trying to think something more on that, John, but I've missed some of that there.
No, that's okay. I think you've covered that well. So then the next group of questions is to do with rating scales. So first one says, I find 1 to 10 scales hard to answer. For example, do I give it a 6 or a 7 or even an 8? Wouldn't it be easier to have written categories such as very useful, useful, not useful, etc.? What are your thoughts about that, Jeff?
Yeah, look, I mean, I've already given my reason for why I go for a 0 to 10, and it's a bit of a, it's because people really generally can rate it reasonably well. If you have a rating of 1 to 5, people are reluctant to give 5, so they'll generally go for a 4 often, and it starts to really limit the variation. People are happy to go for a 9 sometimes rather than a 10, so you're starting to get that little bit more of sensitivity. There's certainly some value for going along the scale and adding little bits about, you know, moderate, more, or whatever, and that's fine. So there's no hard and fast rule, and I can see the advantages of having, you know, each particular one you choose better defined. But for me, I find that with most things, I get a lot of consistency by just having the open scale with the beginning and the end. No right answer though.
Okay. And Jeff, with a web or mail survey, does self-selection by returnees affect the accuracy of your results?
Yes, it does. It can make quite a big difference, and there's a survey I'm doing for our local council at the moment that's demonstrating that. You know, for example, it's an open survey about dogs, and so the large majority of people who respond to people have got dogs rather than the general population, and that's kind of good and it's bad. But the point is that that kind of self-selection does bias it in that way. A couple of ways of dealing with it. One, you can very much target the people who you invite to go into your web survey and really follow them up to try and get as high a response rate as possible with a smaller number of people. Or B, you acknowledge the fact that it's biased. You try and do a bit of a check on people in the general population who sort of test some of the answers against, or you just get more targeted as I suggested.
Okay, and last one for the moment. Jeff, you mentioned about doing some pilot surveys. How many would you suggest are ideal, and only with peers of the with peers or potential target population?
Look, if you do half a dozen, you start getting the answers. You know, you pick your half a dozen people and just go for it, and that's really what I'd do.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. Back to the presentation.
All right. So far we've gone through the surveys and to capacity, and now we're actually going to what actually have people done. We haven't got to that yet, but this is a critical place. Now I've got this interim step here, which is about actions taken, because I think that there are actions that they can take which aren't exactly the practice changes you're after, but they're quite important to know and they're quite critical in the process. So, you know, what actions could people take? They've been involved in a project, a program, they've gone to workshops, they've had people visit them, they've seen things. What actions can they take between getting motivated and actually doing something different? You know, can you think about them? What could they take? So when I think about it, They could do nothing. They could have sought more information. They could have undertaken further training. They could have discussed opportunities with staff and or partners, or they could have implemented one of the practices that you're advocating. And I think if we miss the first few on the list, then I think we really miss an opportunity to see what's happening. I also like to ask them, well, what do you intend to take over the next period? And rather than having a double-edged question here when this all gets confused, I like to separate that out. So look, what have you done, and what might you intend to do in the next kind of period? So that's something I can report on, and that's something that's starting to show that even in the short term we've had an impact. So when we actually get the practice change, we've got a pretty good idea what kind of practice changes we're looking for. You know, if we're running a workshop on managing pastures better, for example, and all our workshops were about how to plant perennials on hills, then one of the obvious practice changes we want to ask is, have you planted any perennials and are they on hills? And in the same thing with something like this, there's some specific practices that we can ask. And I could have made these a little bit more complex because, you know, you could break down using Facebook to something more than just using Facebook. But just for the sake of this exercise, I've got these as key practice changes. So this is for those who have implemented. They've actually marked on here that they've implemented. So these questions either show up on a web survey or are asked by the interviewer. And in this case, I've just given them that kind of choice because they're the three things we're looking for: more use of Facebook, more use of Twitter, more use of LinkedIn, and maybe there are some other things that came out of it. So I've been pretty simplistic here. And again, I want them, though, to briefly explain what they've done. So there's no good just saying Facebook. Well, it's nice to put on a graph, but what does it mean? So here I've got to do a bit of qualitative analysis, and most people do fill this in at some level. And they say, well, look, with Facebook, I've set up a Facebook page for the first time. Or with our Facebook page, we've increased it, and we're updating it every week. And again, I could even put some of those things as options if people press Facebook. So there are different ways of doing it, but I really try to hone in on what's possible or probable based on the activities, the information we've given. Now, I think in an impact survey, you're remiss if you don't start searching for barriers and further needs to really make the changes. So that's why I have that as a section. So I asked them, well, what stopped you or would stop you implementing more use of social media in your business? You know, is it still lacking technical skills? Is it the costs? Don't your staff or your partners want to do it? Are you really just not convinced of the value, or is it just, you know, a lack of time or something? So that's pretty important, understanding barriers. And I think the last webinar we did was all about, you know, adoption and the factors that affect it. And it's good to sort of do your own bit of research on that. Secondly, then, it's also saying, well, all right, we're still interested in this, and there could be follow-up projects. What actually do you need to really help you get going with this? And again, that sort of links in so that you don't just have the bare, oh, this was what people have done. You've got this stuff around it, which makes it a hell of a lot more useful. When we get to impact questions, again, we're thinking about, well, what impact did we expect? So that's the first port of call. And in the key result area, or the SMART goals, we're saying, well, we're after 20% of business growth for those who made a practice change and a 10% increase in profitability. Often these kind of economic figures and sometimes environmental impacts or social impacts are a bit difficult to capture in any quantitative terms, and we've got to use some different kind of ways of doing it. Most of our information for these things are going to come from individual case studies, and often surveys like this are only going to give us a bit of a lick and a promise. But, you know, how do we make the lick and the promise better? And in this case, I've just gone in, really just gone to the bone. And look, if you've started to use or increase your use of social media, and again the question's going to go to those people, what impact has it made to your number of customers? Now, I also give people an opportunity to estimate, because some people actually know what difference they have. And I should have put, well, I've got number per year, your sales income, your profitability. And I've also then asked them, well, what do you expect over the next 12 months? Now, when we do benefit costs, for example, all these estimations are made. We might as well let the people involved make their own estimations, I think. So at least it can temper a little bit what the economists do. So I've just gone in quite straight. asking them about those things that we were looking at delivering on. I could ask them, of course, about other impacts, impacts on staff quality, on quality of work, on staff, on costs, and that's something that I really should do, because here I've just sort of picked up on the benefit. So impact on cost, impact on staff are other things that we could ask for. Again, we could leave this open, like number per year. We could have a category as it increase your customers by 10%, 20%, 50%, or whatever. Now, again, referring to benefit cost analysis and even on impact analysis, we've got to make. We know that our project or activity is not the only game in town. So what economists do and what people are analysing projects do, they make some assessment. Look, there are a whole lot of other things. There are counterfactuals here. Let's say that the project had it's sort of 60% of the influence, and they do that, and that's how a lot of benefit costs are made. So I like to ask the people involved, and there's been a lot of research that say when you ask enough people, they actually can get quite accurate. So I thought, well, here's a good starting point for the economists and whatever. So I asked people, and they seem to have no trouble with answering it. Well, what percentage would you attribute this project and its information to change? It's quite inaccurate, but it's just something that helps counter the pulling the figure out of the air figures by economists. And nothing against economists, we need you. And then I also asked them about what other programs or sources impact on your actions. Now, finally, I might not have asked them the question that they wanted to answer, and it drives them crazy. So at the end, I just say, look, what other comments do you have? And here's where I get a lot of gems. We go through and we analyse them, and we come up with some gems that really, oh, okay, that's what they're all about. And we also get some great quotes here that help illustrate, the kind of trends that are coming out of the survey. So just recapping. My point is, be directed by the survey context, know why you're doing it, how they're going to use the results and what they want it for, what kind of statements do you need to make out of this survey for what purpose. Next, look at this framework or your own framework and systematically consider each element of the framework and what's relevant. Follow those principles for questions, particularly minimum and keep it simple, but, to the point. And remember, look, test it out. It just sort of really gives you that edge. And John and everyone who's listening, that's my quick little thumbnail sketch of looking at impact evaluation surveys. I'm involved in a lot of evaluation projects, as John has pointed out, and it really helps me if people in projects have collected some very good data along the way. And so when an external person comes in at the end, they're presented with some very some data that's been collected systematically and appropriately, and it's stuff that can feed into an external evaluation quite easily. So, and I welcome any feedback.
Great. Hey, Jeff, you've done really well covering such a broad expanse in such a short period of time, so well done. Now, because we've got over 100 people joining us live, there's a number of questions here, so folks, we won't be able to answer all of them, but I know that Jeff will be open to answering them privately afterwards. So what I've done is I've just clustered them together so that the first one, Jeff, is it's actually about analysing the data, which I know you haven't really gone into here, but do you have a preferred program to analyse the quantitative data? And another one is actually asking about the qualitative data and using things like in vivo. So Jeff.
Okay, well look, yeah, just quickly on those two. When we use a web-based platform, for example, for putting a lot of our survey results in, and it automatically generates a lot of the quantitative graphs, at least for the first cut of what we want to look at. So we've got that, but I must admit that I really don't go past Excel. At the moment, it gives all the statistical analysis and other kind of analysis that we need. So I'm really an Excel man, and so are my data analyzers. I know that our biometrician does use other kind of statistical software to do more complex analysis of relationships, and that's good too. In terms of qualitative, no, I don't tend to use NVivo or others. It just takes too long. And I'm afraid I'm one of those terrible consultants who just do look at the bottom line and the benefits you get at a certain time. And we do very systematic qualitative analysis. We look for themes and we put them into tables. But I don't go through something like NVivo because just the time, and it doesn't really give me the appropriate data at the end. For other social research surveys, that would be great, but that's not for most of these.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. And just one last question. What do you do when you're in the unfortunate position where the project you're trying to evaluate doesn't have clear SMART goals or KRAs and just it hasn't been designed correctly? What advice can you give to people in that sort of situation?
All right. Well, what I often do when I come in towards an end to do an impact evaluation is we actually sit down with the project team and those involved, and we do a bit of a log frame then. And it's actually quite good because you work retrospectively and work out, well, what actually did we do? What's possible from what we did? And in a sense, you can kind of really work it out and hone it in, which can really help in the design of questions and doing the evaluation. And you're very upfront with how you develop that, and everything then fits together. And everyone says, great, well, that's what we did, and that's why we did it, and this is the results we got. Let's go from there.
That's really good. Thanks for that, Jeff. So folks, we've covered as much of the material we can today, but hey, let's not allow this to be just another flash in the pan type activity. So I've created this little blog here called, naturally enough, Enabling Change and Innovation, and you can see the URL in the bottom of my screen here. So this is going to enable us to continue the discussion afterwards. So in the next day or so, I'll send you an email with a link to the blog, where incidentally you'll find a recording of today's webinar and also a copy of Jeff's PowerPoint slides. So if you missed them, you'll be able to get them off the blog shortly. And also in that email, I'll invite you to complete a short survey about today's event so that we can further improve them. Now, a cute little feature of the website is that I'm using user voice, which allows you to nominate and vote on future webinar topics. Because I'm running these webinars every 6 weeks or so, and I'll try to stay one step ahead of you by announcing the next topic at the end of the previous webinar. So folks, today I'm pleased to announce that the next webinar will be about using online tools to engage the public. So our next guest presenter, all the way from Canada, will be Matt Leininger, who recently wrote the report Using Online Tools to Engage and Be Engaged by the Public. So come along. So it's scheduled for Tuesday the 18th of September at 11 AM, so it's just an hour earlier than normal because it'll be night time for Matt. Now, the webinar today has been brought to you by a partnership between the Queensland Government, for whom I have the pleasure of working, APEN, our professional organisation for extension in Australia, and also Citrix GoToWebinar. So at this stage, I'll invite Tracy Giannatti from APEN to tell us a bit more about APEN. Tracy, we can't quite hear you though.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Right. Hello everyone, and thanks John for the introduction. My name's Tracy Giannatti and I'm the past president of APEN based in Perth. And APEN is a proud supporter of these webinars, as John has just mentioned. So what is APEN exactly? It's the Australasia Pacific Extension Network and is the lead organisation for extension professionals working in the primary industries, natural resource management and community development sectors. I'm guessing that you're all here today because you're involved in some way with helping people to innovate and change in their business, industries and communities. And extension is one word often used to describe this process. And APEN believes that effective extension requires specialist skills and knowledge. So we support our members and the broader extension community through networking, professional development and representation. There are currently 500 members in our network across Australia, New Zealand and Asia. And you can interact with our members at our international conferences, national forums, newsletter and local events. And if you would like to join us, it's a very reasonable cost of only $90 a year plus GST. And for more information, please visit our website at www.apen.org.au. And we look forward to you becoming part of APEN's active and innovative network across the Australasia Pacific region. Thank you.
Good on you. Thanks, Tracy. Now, our other webinar partner is Citrix's GoToWebinar, which powered today's presentation, and they're offering a free trial of their product and a discounted subscription. So just tick the appropriate boxes in the follow-up survey that you'll be receiving in the next day or so. So folks, this is actually what the survey will look like, powered by SurveyMonkey, my survey of choice. So, of course, all of you appreciate the importance of survey results. So I'll be expecting a 100% response rate from all of you as I follow up from today's event. So, folks, thanks for attending and interacting today. I'd like to thank Jeff again for his presentation. Yeah, you did a fantastic job, Jeff, just covering so much. And for those who still have questions, then come to the blog. So I'll send out the link to you, and then you'll be able to ask extra questions of Jeff, and I'm sure he'll be able to respond. And we'll also put Jeff's contact details there for those who are wanting to engage with him further. So finally, thank you to all our attendees who have come along today. Many have stayed up late at night, I can see, over in Canada. And thanks for interacting with us today. I look forward to seeing your comments and ideas over on the blog. So wishing you all the best until we meet again. Hooroo for now.